There are women who spend their entire lives holding everything together, and one day, when the noise fades, they realize they no longer know who they are. This is a story about a woman who learned that it is never too late to finally choose herself. The water was already running when the sun had not yet decided to rise. Her hands moved automatically through soap and porcelain and silverware. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it ever had before. For 30 years, mornings had belonged to someone else's needs. Today, there was no one asking for breakfast. The house in Ohio felt larger now, almost hollow. The refrigerator hummed like an old companion who refused to speak. She dried a plate slowly, listening for footsteps that would not come. Her son's laughter no longer echoed down the hallway. Her daughter's music had long since faded into memory. She told herself this was normal, that this was what raising children meant. You give them roots, and then you give them wings. She had repeated that phrase at every graduation and goodbye. But no one had warned her about the silence afterward. No one had told her the silence could feel like erasure. Her husband still slept upstairs, undisturbed and unaware. He would come down expecting coffee, like always. She would hand it to him with the same quiet efficiency. It was a dance they had perfected over decades, a choreography of service without applause. As she turned off the faucet, she caught her reflection in the dark window. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back. There were lines around her eyes she did not remember earning. There was a heaviness in her shoulders she could not name. And beneath it all, there was a question forming. The table was set for two, though it felt like a table for strangers. She placed the plates carefully, aligning the forks by habit. Her husband scrolled through his phone before even sitting down. The glow of the screen lit his face more than the overhead lamp. She waited for him to notice the meal she had prepared. He thanked her without looking up, voice distant and automatic. She nodded, pretending not to mind the absence of eye contact. They had once filled dinners with stories and shared complaints. Now the only sound was the clink of cutlery against ceramic. Silence settled between them like an uninvited guest. She tried to tell him about her day, though nothing remarkable had happened. She mentioned the neighbor's new mailbox and the weather forecast. Her words felt small, fragile, almost unnecessary. He responded with brief nods, still reading something unseen. She felt herself shrinking with every passing second. There was a time when he had reached for her hand across this table. A time when their knees touched beneath it on purpose. She searched his face for a trace of that memory. But years of routine had worn the edges smooth. Love had become logistics. When dinner ended, he carried his plate to the sink without speaking. She watched him disappear into the living room's blue light. The television replaced conversation with background noise. She remained at the table a little longer than needed, and for the first time, she wondered when she had become invisible. The door creaked as she pushed it open slowly. Her daughter's room still smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The bed was neatly made, untouched for months. Sunlight filtered through pale curtains onto the silent floor. Dust danced where laughter once lived. She stepped inside as if entering sacred ground. Her fingers traced the edge of the dresser gently. There were faint marks on the wall where posters used to hang. She remembered late-night talks about heartbreak and exams. She remembered feeling needed. On the desk sat a forgotten hair tie and a dried pen, small relics of a life that had moved forward. Her daughter now lived 3 states away with her own routines. Phone calls were shorter than they used to be. Love remained, but dependence had vanished. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet. Motherhood had defined every decision she made. Meals, schedules, sacrifices, dreams postponed indefinitely. She had worn exhaustion like a badge of honor. Now there was nothing demanding her fatigue. As she stood to leave, a wave of something unfamiliar washed over her. It was not sadness exactly, and not pride either. It was a hollow space where purpose once pulsed. In the doorway, she paused, unsure why her chest felt tight. Without someone to need her. Who was she? The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the checkout line. She placed milk, bread, and apples onto the conveyor belt. Ordinary items for an ordinary life. She kept her eyes on her purse, counting coupons. She did not expect conversation. The woman behind her smiled warmly and said hello. They exchanged polite comments about the long line. Then the stranger asked casually, almost playfully, "So, what do you like to do just for yourself?" The words landed harder than they should have. She opened her mouth to answer and found nothing there. Her mind scanned decades of birthdays and holidays. It found recipes, carpools, hospital visits, school plays. It found anniversaries and grocery lists and bills. It found no clear image of herself alone. The stranger laughed gently, filling the silence. "Oh, I just started painting last year," she added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if beginning again were simple, as if identity were allowed to evolve. She forced a small smile and completed the transaction. Walking to her car, the question echoed relentlessly. What did she like to do just for herself? The steering wheel felt foreign in her hands. For the first time, she did not know the answer. If her silence feels familiar to you, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts below. Sometimes the first step to finding ourselves is simply admitting we are still searching. That evening, she stood alone at the kitchen sink again. The sky outside had turned a deep shade of indigo. Streetlights flickered on one by one down the block. Her reflection merged with the darkening glass. She studied it as if meeting a stranger. She leaned closer, noticing details she had long ignored. The softness around her jaw, the silver in her hair, the faint scar on her chin from childhood. There was history written across her skin, but where was the woman beneath the rolls? Her hands rested on the counter, slightly trembling. These hands had bandaged scraped knees and packed countless lunches. They had folded laundry and held hospital forms. They had comforted, served, supported, endured. They had rarely created anything just for her. A whisper formed in her mind, fragile but persistent. What if there is still time? The thoughts scared her more than regret ever had, because hope requires courage, and courage demands change. Upstairs, the television murmured in the background. Life continued as it always had. Nothing dramatic had happened that day, yet something irreversible had shifted inside her. And she could no longer pretend she had not heard the question. The next morning, the alarm rang out of habit, not necessity. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling in the pale gray light. For years, her body had risen before her thoughts could protest, but this time, she did not move immediately. She allowed herself to remain still. The house waited for her, expectant and quiet. There were beds to make and counters to wipe. There was laundry already sorted in careful piles, invisible tasks lined up like obedient soldiers, yet none of them were urgent. She walked to the kitchen and poured her coffee slowly. The steam rose in delicate spirals toward the ceiling. Instead of reaching for a sponge, she pulled out a chair. She sat down at the table in the early silence. The simple act felt almost rebellious. Her heart beat faster, as if she were doing something wrong. A voice inside her whispered that she was being lazy, that good wives and good mothers do not sit idly, that worth is measured in productivity and sacrifice. She had believed that voice for decades, but as she took the first sip of coffee, something softened. The warmth spread through her chest like permission. Nothing collapsed because she was sitting down. No one called out her name in disappointment. And in that fragile quiet, she felt a crack in the old rules. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the basement searching for nothing specific. The air smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. Shelves were lined with labeled boxes from years of careful storage. Memories stacked neatly, like the life she had curated. Her fingers brushed against one box without a label. She pulled it down slowly and sat on the cool cement floor. The lid resisted at first, then gave way with a soft sigh. Inside were notebooks, photographs, and folded papers. She recognized her own handwriting instantly. It looked younger, more certain. There were sketches of dresses she had once imagined designing, pages filled with color swatches and fabric notes, a letter she had written to herself at 22. In it, she promised never to forget her creativity. She promised to live boldly. Tears gathered before she understood why. She had not thought about fashion school in 30 years. Marriage had come, then children, then responsibilities. Dreams had not disappeared, only been postponed. Postponed long enough to be forgotten. She held one drawing against her chest and closed her eyes. The girl who made those sketches still existed somewhere inside, not erased, only buried beneath obligation. For the first time, regret felt less powerful than possibility. And possibility frightened her in a new way. 2 days later, she stood outside the community center in town. The building was modest, with a faded blue door. A small sign announced beginner sewing workshop, Thursdays. Her name was on the registration list. She almost turned around. Her palms were damp as she stepped inside. The room smelled of fabric and fresh coffee. 6 other women sat around long folding tables, some younger, some her age, all chatting softly. She chose a seat near the edge. The instructor greeted her with an easy smile. "Welcome. I'm glad you're here," she said warmly. No one asked why she had waited until 54. No one questioned her timing or her worth. They simply handed her fabric and thread. As she guided the material under the needle, her hands trembled. It had been decades since she had sewn anything personal. The hum of the machine filled the room gently. Each stitch felt like reclaiming a forgotten language. Her breathing began to steady. When the class ended, she remained seated for a moment. On the table in front of her lay a small, imperfect piece of fabric. It was uneven and slightly crooked, but it was hers, created by choice. And walking to her car, she felt both terrified and alive. That evening, her husband noticed the folded fabric on the counter. "What's this?" he asked casually, barely glancing at it. She hesitated before answering. "It's from a class I joined," she said softly. The words felt heavier than expected. He looked up briefly, surprised. "A class? Since when?" There was no anger in his tone, only confusion, as if deviation from routine required explanation. As if she had stepped outside an invisible boundary, she swallowed and steadied herself. "Since this week," she replied, meeting his eyes. For once, she did not rush to justify the decision. She did not list how it would not interfere with dinner. She did not apologize for existing beyond the kitchen. He nodded slowly, returning his gaze to the television. "Well, that's different," he murmured. The word lingered in the air between them. Different had always been something to avoid. Now it felt like oxygen. Later that night, lying awake, she replayed the exchange. Her heart had pounded, but she had not retreated. It was a small moment, barely noticeable from the outside. Yet inside her, a boundary had shifted. She had chosen not to shrink. The following Thursday, she arrived at class a little earlier. The sky was streaked with soft pink and gold. She carried her sewing kit with quiet determination. This time, she did not hover near the door. She walked directly to the table. A woman beside her smiled and extended a hand. "I'm Claire," she said brightly. There was warmth in her expression, genuine curiosity. "And you are?" she asked. The question felt different this time. For years, introductions had sounded the same. "I'm Tom's wife," or "I'm Emily's mom." Her identity had always been attached to someone else's name. Those titles were true, but incomplete. Now she hesitated for a new reason. She inhaled slowly and felt her shoulders relax. "My name is Margaret," she said clearly. The syllables felt unfamiliar yet grounding. Claire repeated it with a smile. "Nice to meet you, Margaret." Something shifted quietly in that exchange. No explanation of her roles followed. No mention of her family or her obligations. Just her name, standing on its own. And for the first time in years, it felt enough. The words had been gathering inside her for weeks. They sat heavy in her chest like unsent letters. That night, she turned off the television herself. The sudden silence startled them both. Her heart pounded, but she did not retreat. "We need to talk," she said gently, not angrily. Her voice carried no accusation, only honesty. Her husband looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She folded her hands together to keep them steady. For once, she was not asking for permission. She told him she felt invisible in her own life. She explained how the silence of the house had exposed something deeper, how she had spent decades being necessary but never known. Her words were careful, but they did not apologize. They trembled with truth. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. There were long pauses between sentences. He admitted he had grown used to things staying the same. He had not realized she was disappearing inside them. Routine had blinded him. The conversation did not end in dramatic promises. There were no grand gestures or sudden transformations, but something fragile and important had begun. She had spoken without shrinking, and he had listened without dismissing. 2 days later, the neighbor knocked on her door. She needed help organizing a church fundraiser. As always, for years, Margaret would have said yes without thinking. She would have rearranged her schedule quietly. She would have absorbed the extra weight. The request hung in the air between them. Margaret felt the old reflex rising in her throat. Say yes, be useful, be dependable. That voice had shaped her entire adulthood. It felt almost sacred, but beneath it, another voice had grown stronger. A quieter one, but steady and firm. It reminded her of the sewing class that evening. of the fabric waiting patiently on her table, of the promise she was beginning to make to herself. "I can't this time," she heard herself say. The words felt foreign and dangerous. The neighbor blinked in surprise, but nodded politely. "That's all right," she replied after a moment. And just like that, the world did not collapse. When the door closed, Margaret leaned against it. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from release. No lightning struck. No one accused her of selfishness. The air in her lungs felt lighter than before. For the first time, her no had protected her yes. The sewing machine hummed steadily beneath her fingertips. The fabric this time was deep blue, soft and forgiving. She had chosen it without consulting anyone else. It would become a simple blouse, nothing extravagant, but it would belong entirely to her. Her hands moved with increasing confidence. These same hands had bathed babies and folded endless laundry. They had signed permission slips and stirred countless soups. They had comforted others through sickness and heartbreak. Now they were shaping something of her own design. She noticed how her shoulders no longer felt so heavy. The tension that once lived there had loosened. Each completed scene felt like a reclaimed fragment of self. She was not abandoning her family. She was remembering herself within it. When she tried the blouse on for the first time, she stood in front of the bedroom mirror quietly. The fabric draped imperfectly, slightly uneven at the hem. Yet her reflection looked different somehow. There was intention in her posture. She touched the cloth over her heart and smiled softly. This was not about clothing or late dreams. It was about proving she could still begin. Her hands had always known how to care. Now they also knew how to create. The next morning, she woke before the alarm again. Sunlight filtered gently through the curtains. The house was still quiet, but it felt less threatening. Silence no longer meant absence. It meant space. She walked to the kitchen without rushing. The sink was empty because she had left it that way. Coffee brewed as birds stirred outside the window. She sat down at the table by choice, not rebellion. There was no guilt this time. Her husband joined her minutes later. He noticed the blouse she was wearing. "That's new," he said, studying it carefully. "I made it," she replied, meeting his gaze. There was pride in her voice, not defiance. He looked at her longer than usual. "I didn't know you could do that," he admitted softly. She almost answered, "You never asked." But instead, she simply smiled, because she had not known either. The morning felt different, not because everything had changed, but because she had. The house was the same, the marriage still imperfect. Yet she occupied the space differently, and that difference was undeniable. Weeks passed, marked not by dramatic events, but by steady growth. Sewing classes continued, and new projects filled her evenings. Conversations at home became more honest, sometimes uncomfortable. There were still old habits to unlearn, but she no longer erased herself to keep peace. She visited her daughter one weekend and wore the blue blouse. "You look happy, Mom," her daughter observed gently. The comment startled her more than any question had before. Happy was not a word she often claimed, yet she felt its quiet truth. Caring for others remained part of her nature. She still cooked dinners and answered phone calls late at night. She still showed up when someone truly needed her, but she no longer did it from emptiness. She did it from wholeness. One evening, standing at the kitchen window again, she saw her reflection in the glass. The same lines framed her eyes. The same silver threads wove through her hair. But now there was light behind them. She understood something simple and powerful at last. Her hands had always been strong. They were never meant only for sacrifice. They were meant to build a life that included her. And at 54, she was finally whole. Thank you for walking beside Margaret on this quiet, powerful journey. If her story touched something inside you, consider subscribing and staying with us, because no matter your age, it is never too late to begin again.